So the last video we soldered all the components on the board except the LEDs and the power supply connector. I've recommended maybe putting these in backwards. You can choose it either way, but you need to make sure the negative or the shorter leg of the LED is lined up with a flat symbol of this, whether you do it on the top of the board or the bottom. You do need to solder on where the little pad is for soldering those. So if you're doing it this way, you need to be doing the solder underneath the LEDs. So I'm going to quickly show you that. You need to make sure they're not connecting together as well. Make sure you've wiped the tip of your soldering iron so it remains nice and shiny. You have to keep doing that as you do it, and then we'll start soldering. Make sure you're putting heat into the board as well as the LED leg, so you get a nice clean solder joint. It's a little bit trickier soldering like this, and you want to be neat. First one I had a bit of trouble because my soldering iron's not warm enough. Let's do this one and wait a little bit longer and then feed in the solder, and you'll get a nicer joint. Sorry that's not very clear on the screen, I'll move that up a little bit closer. So holding it, heating up both components, then add your solder once everything's hot. Don't overheat the pads on the printed circuit board because they will delaminate from the board if you heat them up too much. So that's my first 3 LEDs. I'm going to continue now and do the rest, making it really clear that my negative is in the right position. So I've got the rest of my LEDs fitted, just yet to solder them. Once again, take your time soldering, because if they join underneath, you're going to have a short circuit and it will not do what it's meant to do. So I've got all the LEDs soldered. It's a bit of an unusual way to solder them on that direction of the board, but I want to mount this into a system and have them everything else tucked in behind. I've also done our power supply, so a couple of little solder joints there. So this is all done. I'm not going to cut off the LED legs until I've tested it, just in case something's wrong and I have to pull that out. So we're going to incorporate these designs into our game. Maybe a scoring, like if something hits a trigger, it'll kind of send the LEDs flashing. I'm using a little trigger switch, but what we learned about switches before, you can maybe choose a tilt switch or a little push button switch. And we need to include that in the circuit. So I'm going to put a red wire firstly to 5 volt. I've tinned both sides, so I won't need my solder. I'll just need to heat both sides and it should go together. I'm going to do the same for a ground cable, so a negative. I'll use a black cable for that just to make it easy to identify. I've tinned both sides. I just hold it together with a heat and it should go together quite easily. And then I'm going to include my trigger switch on that. So what I've done is I've broken the ground, and then I'm going to solder this one into position in there, so when the trigger goes on, our LEDs should start flashing. When you're tinning the trigger switch, we'll have to make sure that a bit of heat goes into this. So best way to do that is probably like weigh it down so it doesn't move when we're doing it. Hold some heat on, and before you put the solder on, let it heat up, and then we can add our solder once the component's hot. So now I've got the battery in place. I've got my ground split with my switch. I've got my positive and ground on the power here. All the components underneath. I'll test if this works. So if I touch my trigger switch, my LEDs start to rotate. So that could signify a goal or whatever you want to use it for in your game. Another thing you could do is maybe use one of those rolling ball tilt switches. So as something gets hit, it kind of flips down, and then that would trigger the scoreboard, or however you want to use the LEDs in your game to operate. Hopefully you have success with your little circuit.